He walked into the sea like any other vacationer, a narrow figure under a wide-brimmed hat, folds of skin catching the late sun. He never returned from that swim. For decades, the man who had been one of the most wanted figures of the post-war world had lived in plain sight, under false names, moving between small towns and coastal villages, until a single moment of fragility ended the long illusion of anonymity. This is the story of Josef Mengele. The relentless hunt for him, the networks that carried him across continents, and the slow forensic work that eventually exposed his secret post-war whereabouts. Josef Mengele's name became shorthand for a particular kind of cruelty. As a physician stationed at Auschwitz, he exercised power over life and death. Prisoners later testified that the worst choices often required the least evidence of thought. In the years after 1945, he did not face trial. Instead, like a number of Nazi functionaries and officers, he vanished into the chaos of defeated Germany and the fractured world that followed. The reasons why men like Mengele escaped immediate accountability are not reducible to a single cause. They were the product of disarray, of sympathetic networks, and of shifting geopolitical priorities that often placed Cold War calculations above the pursuit of former perpetrators. To understand how a doctor accused of crimes against humanity could go missing, one must look at the pipelines forged in the war's aftermath. The so-called rat lines were neither a single organization nor an improbable conspiracy. They were a patchwork of roots, facilitators, and opportunists. Forged identity papers, sympathetic clerics in certain places, organized smuggling through southern European ports, and private transport across the Atlantic provided practical means for fugitives to leave Europe. Many of these movements were enabled by a fractured bureaucracy and the willingness of intermediaries, some motivated by ideology, some by profit, some by a belief that old soldiers should be spared, to process or ignore the past. The roots themselves shifted with circumstance. Men and women who once moved with the machinery of a state now relied on small networks, a safe house in northern Italy, a steamer ticket to South America bought under a false name, a forged passport stamped at a port in Genoa or Naples. From there, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil were the most common destinations, in part because of established immigrant communities, lax immigration controls at particular moments, and in some cases social or political climates that tolerated, or ignored, the presence of European refugees who did not volunteer full histories. Once in South America, fugitive lives varied. Some kept low profiles in urban centers. Others retreated to isolated towns where anonymity was easier to maintain. Josef Mengele's post-war existence followed a pattern of movement and concealment documented in fragments across archival documents, witness statements, and later investigative reports. He is reported to have arrived in Argentina in the late 1940s, specific port and date indefinido, and to have taken up residence intermittently in Buenos Aires and its suburbs. Witness reports and later intelligence filings place him at times in rural provinces and at other times near border regions that provided quick routes into Paraguay and, eventually, Brazil. Exact lists of aliases used by Mengele have been recorded in various sources. Some are verified, others remain contested. For any definitive list, mark as indefinido pending archival confirmation. Daily life for a fugitive like Mengele combined ordinary routines with constant care not to attract attention. He cultivated quiet habits, modest lodgings, irregular travel, and relationships with a small circle of acquaintances whose precise roles are differently described in different records. Some accounts point to help from local sympathizers and from convoys of Europeans who shared information or offered shelter. Other accounts stress the opportunistic assistance of forgers and smugglers, people who treated these arrangements as business. Responsibility for these movements often lay in the small decisions of many hands rather than in a single centralized network. The international pursuit of Mengele was likewise not the work of a single agency. In the immediate post-war decades, formal state investigations were uneven. Some governments prioritized locating high-profile fugitives, while others treated such cases as secondary amid the existential tensions of the Cold War. Into this gap stepped private Nazi hunters, Jewish organizations, investigative journalists, and a few determined state actors. Individuals and small teams compiled leads from photographs, travel records, and chance eyewitnesses. They followed a pattern that recurs in many manhunts: a grainy photograph, a name on a document, a remembered face in a cafe, and then the long, patient labor of cross-checking, persuading local authorities to act, and attempting to move from suspicion to legal evidence. Among the most persistent pursuers were independent investigators associated with Holocaust survivor organizations. Their methods combined archival research with field work. They traced passenger manifests, followed up on immigration clerks' recollections, and interviewed former neighbors and co-workers. Journalists also played a crucial role, publicizing sightings and creating pressure for official inquiries. State intelligence services occasionally supplied leads. At other times, Cold War politics diverted intelligence priorities away from hunting former Nazis and toward countering perceived Soviet threats. These shifting priorities sometimes meant that leads went cold or that opportunities to arrest suspects were missed. Missed chances are a recurring theme in this story. On multiple occasions over the decades, reports placed Mengele in proximity to arrest. Sightings in provincial towns, tip-offs that reached foreign offices, and alleged opportunities where cooperation between local and international authorities might have led to detention. Some of these episodes are documented in government correspondence and press accounts. Others remain indefinido, or disputed among historians. What is clear is that a combination of bureaucratic inertia, legal obstacles, including questions of extradition and the need for irrefutable identity evidence, and at times, local reluctance to act, prolonged the fugitive's freedom. There were near captures that, in retrospect, appear heartbreakingly avoidable. A mistaken identity here, a delayed translation there, officials who required formal warrants that took months to secure. The everyday mechanics of law enforcement worked against swift action. The nature of the evidence in these cases was often circumstantial: a photograph that resembled a wanted man, a surname matching a passport, and juridical systems require more than resemblance. By the time corroborating evidence could be assembled, suspects had moved. The mobility of fugitives in borderlands, crossing from Argentina into Paraguay, then across rivers into Brazil, exploited legal and geographic seams. The circumstances of Mengele's death and the discovery of his remains are central to how the story finally resolved itself. In the winter of 1979, local records report the drowning of a man identified at the time under an assumed name. Exact date, location, and the name used at burial, indefinido. These items require primary source verification. For years, the death was recorded in municipal ledgers, but not linked publicly to the narrative pursued by Nazi hunters. It was only through piecemeal correlation of local records, witness statements, and investigative leads that attention returned to that seaside grave. The link between a small-town death certificate and the broader international manhunt emerged only after patient archival work and the crossing of national files. Forensic identification in this case played out over years rather than weeks. Initial examinations of remains and burial records provided possible matches. Later, more sophisticated analyses strengthened the case. Methods reported in various accounts include dental comparisons and bone analysis, and later still molecular techniques that did not exist in the immediate post-war period. Where explicit claims are made about specific forensic tests, dates, or laboratories involved, those details should be considered indefinido pending confirmation from laboratory reports and official forensic files. The cautious story is this: by combining anthropological assessment with documented medical records and ultimately genetic comparison, investigators were able to establish a high degree of confidence that the remains were those of Josef Mengele. Which laboratories performed which tests, and when those results were finalized, are matters requiring direct documentary citation. The final confirmation, when it arrived, resolved a legal and symbolic question. Mengele would not stand trial. He had died before justice could be administered in a courtroom. That absence of a formal trial left unresolved feelings of injustice among survivors and their families, even as the identification of his remains closed the physical mystery of where he ended his days. For many, The posthumous confirmation was an important factual end to a manhunt that had spanned continents and decades. For others, it was a reminder that legal accountability had been denied by time and circumstance. Historians and legal scholars have debated the reasons men like Mengele evaded capture for so long. Several structural causes recur: the scattering of records and witnesses in the immediate post-war years, the pragmatic choices of governments who, in the early Cold War, sometimes traded justice for intelligence, the logistical difficulty of cross-border law enforcement in South America's vast countryside, and the existence of private networks willing to assist in identity changes and transport. Beyond institutions, there is also a moral and social dimension. Communities that hosted fugitives often preferred stability to the inconvenient disruptions of reopening wartime histories. In some places, locals welcomed European immigrants without inquiring into origins. In others, small-town life simply allowed new arrivals to blend. This history raises persistent ethical questions. What does it mean for a society to allow perpetrators to live out old age unknown to most of the world? Does the post-mortem identification of a fugitive restore some measure of historical truth? For survivors, the answers are complicated. Confirmation of identity can validate years of testimony and suffering, but it cannot substitute for the accountability of a trial, the public naming of crimes under oath, or the moral reckoning that prosecution can produce. The absence of trial leaves open a kind of moral scar. The record of deeds is established, but the ritual of legal judgment, the state's formal condemnation, did not occur. There is another, quieter consequence to this history, the example it sets about memory and vigilance. The networks that enabled escape teach a cautionary lesson about complicity in small acts. Forgers, smugglers, silent neighbors, and reluctant officials did not, in most cases, set out to shape historical outcomes. They contributed through choices that privileged expedience, profit, or social harmony over truth. Naming those structural dynamics is not the same as ascribing singular culpability to any individual in a distant village. It is rather a call to recognize how ordinary systems, immigration control, municipal record-keeping, legal thresholds for evidence, can be turned into instruments of concealment when ethical resolve is absent. The archives hold fragments that, taken together, demonstrate both the persistence of the hunt and the depth of the evasions. Grainy passport photos, notes from embassy files marked with dates and question marks, newspaper clippings of alleged sightings, and handwritten witness accounts across 3 languages. These are the materials investigators stitched into a narrative over decades. Each document required corroboration. Each lead demanded the kind of cross-border cooperation that was not always forthcoming. Ultimately, the unraveling of anonymity in this case relied on patient, painstaking forensic work, and on the unrelenting attention of survivors and investigators who refused to let the story lapse into forgetfulness. If there are episodes of culpability by institutions, failures to extradite, delays in sharing intelligence, or political choices that deprioritized prosecution in favor of other aims, those charges must be assessed against documentary records. Where historians have argued for institutional neglect or worse, their claims are based on archival evidence and deserve careful consideration. Where assertions have been made without documentary underpinning, they should be labeled as disputed or indefinito until verified. The legacy of this pursuit is not limited to the fate of one man. It prompted legal reforms in some countries, renewed efforts to preserve evidence from wartime atrocities, and the creation of specialized investigative units devoted to war crimes. It also intensified debates about historical memory, how societies remember perpetrators, how museums and memorials present these lives, and how educational systems teach future generations both to recognize horror and to demand accountability. In the end, the story of Josef Mengele's post-war years is an uncomfortable mirror. It shows how easily a person implicated in morally monstrous acts can be hidden by geography and bureaucracy, and how difficult the movement from suspicion to legal proof can be. It shows the alternating persistence and limits of human pursuit, the dogged work of hunters, the occasional missteps and missed chances, and the eventual, if belated, success of forensic science to answer questions that paperwork and witness memory alone could not. Archival testimony collected by survivor organizations captures the human urgency behind these institutional files. "We could not let him simply disappear," reads one brief archival fragment from a survivor group report. That insistence drove decades of investigation, public pressure, and scholarly work. It is a reminder that memory is itself a form of investigation, an insistence on naming, on refusing amnesia. There is no tidy, moralized ending to a life ended at the water's edge under an alias. What the archives and the forensic reports did achieve was to close a factual gap and to place a final mark on one part of the historical record. What they cannot do is undo the harm done or fully satisfy the demands for justice that survived victims and their descendants still feel. The work left for historians and for civil society is to keep these narratives accessible, to ensure that the procedural details of escape and concealment are not lost, to preserve documentary evidence for future inquiry, and to use this history to inform contemporary debates about accountability for mass crimes. If this account has raised questions for you about sources, dates, or the detailed forensic steps, consult the references in the description for a bibliography and archival pointers. Specific items flagged as indefinido in this narrative, the exact ports of departure, each alias with documentary backing, the precise dates of sightings and forensic reports, require consultation of primary records before publication or citation as definitive fact. We end with a simple premise: memory and truth require effort. The relentless hunt for Josef Mengele did not produce a courtroom verdict, but it did produce a record, a reconstruction of movement, of concealment, and of eventual exposure. That record matters. It is the basis upon which history and possibly justice can be pursued by future generations. If you want detailed archival sources, primary documents, and further reading on post-war fugitive networks and forensic identification in this case, check the description for a curated list. Subscribe for more investigative history, and for the other stories where evidence and persistence bring hidden past back into the light.